Yeah, Mehmed Ali. So I'm currently Director of Academic Services here at Air University in Montgomery, and been down here in Alabama for about 4 years. I oversee a team that supports all the schools and centers at the university, including the library and the registrar office, the university press, the research office, and a couple of the teams. Um, Sort of my background, I've been working for the feds off and on for decades. This is actually my sixth federal agency, but historian by trade, and got a PhD in history from University of Connecticut, focusing on urban history and focusing on actually a big piece of my research work was about a neighborhood in Lowell, Massachusetts called Little Canada, which was wiped clean in the 1960s during the urban renewal craze. So sort of have always had an affinity for places that don't exist anymore, except in people's memories. Uh, and uh, and so I've done quite a bit of research, and I even explore with my camera vacant buildings and other sort of abandoned properties as part of thinking about what was there. You know, you can't get into the time machine to travel, but through talking to people and reading, documents like at the county archives, you can sort of put the flesh on some of the skeletons that exist out in the history land. Yeah, I've done off and on some interesting research on, again, in my hometown of Lowell. I worked on a project when I was stationed at Pearl Harbor in uniform many years ago, and we did a site survey for an old plantation village, a sugar plantation village on Oahu, as part of the Eva district. And that was really interesting. So the streets were still there, and most of the sort of bungalow, small cottages were there. And we did some sort of early GPS mapping and sort of trying to put again uh, the lost sort of narrative back on the table for people to understand of what was this area. We were doing this as part of an effort because they were ready to rip down the remains of this. It was already abandoned, but the physical remains were still there in order to do it a development. So as part of the historic preservation kind of offset, if you will, was to document this village. So sort of done some research, academic research, but also practical application on sort of preservation work. So I am, yeah. So I'm putting together a book right now called Maxwell and the Movement, and the subtitle is "Race, Rights, and the Air Force in Montgomery, Alabama." And so it's exploring issues of the African American community here in Montgomery in vis-a-vis the relationship with the Maxwell Air Force Base. So therefore, Maxwell and the Movement. So lots of interesting stories, including airmen participating in the Montgomery bus boycott, a landmark a case involving civilian hirings and discrimination against African Americans. But there's a sort of a unique early component of the research which focuses on this neighborhood called Douglasville. And there's not much out there on Douglasville. And what was Douglasville? So again, like much of Alabama, there was a plantation in the Black Belt, right? Not in all of Alabama, but especially in the Black Belt. So there was the Reese plantation, which had about 1,000 acres, 1,100 acres, I think, and it occupied this sort of bend in the river, this bluff that exists out there today, which ended up where Maxwell Air Force Base became. So post Civil War, um, lots of African Americans came to the cities, right? They left the plantation economy They left the sharecropping kind of status, uh, and they came to the cities for other opportunities. Some of that was for safety purposes. Some of that was for educational opportunities. Some of it was, the openness that comes in a city that you cannot always have when you're on a small rural environment. Um, so as part of that, around 1898, somebody developed a, a neighborhood, sold off plots from this larger plantation that was kind of not in existence anymore, or reduced scope, and created Douglasville. And some the main thoroughfare through Douglasville is Washington Ferry Road, which still exists in the city of Montgomery, and even over towards the river near right across from Prattville. So what was Douglasville? Douglasville was a sort of self-contained, uh, uh, segregated neighborhood, which had not everything you needed, but a lot. So besides small farms and the ability to grow your own food, there were a couple stores, there were four restaurants, there was an auto mechanic, there was a doctor, there was three churches, there were several social organizations. There was three Masonic kind of affiliations. There was the Douglasville Charitable Benevolent Society, which was sort of an insurance company in a way to take care of people, especially for their deaths and burials. And there was a sort of a civic life, even relatively small, but a couple hundred families congregated in this area. There were renters, but many of the folks owned their own homes, again, which is sort of not necessarily typical for many African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. And so again, it was sort of a interesting home and neighborhood. I had the opportunity to interview a woman who was born in a house in Douglasville. She lives in Tuskegee today, and she, Elizabeth Shipley, and she talked about how it was such a sort of vibrant place, and her parents were so content there. Uh, but other forces sort of spelled the end of this neighborhood, which I can talk more about. So the large landowner surrounding Douglasville was a guy named Frank Cohn, Kohn, and grew up here in Montgomery, a Catholic, and really a terrific sort of entrepreneur. Got into he had the plantation, sort of the residual plantation efforts, but also he got into cotton factoring and all sorts of other endeavors. And one of the things he was most interested in is technology and what could be. So in 1910, who came to town but one of the Wright brothers of Wright Brothers aviation fame. And they were looking for a place to set up a civilian aviation school. And why would they come to Montgomery? Well, if you look at Montgomery, the weather's pretty good. The wind, they were looking at wind factors. They were looking at being able to fly during the winter months, et cetera. So lots of good opportunities. So lo and behold, the Wright brothers were here. They went to go look at this piece of land. They went to go look at this piece of land. It looks like there was nothing that was suitable. And somebody was sitting in the businessmen's club, overheard the conversation and said, "You should go look at the Cohn plantation." And when they went out there, this is it. And so they decided to set up the aviation school there. So Mr. Cohn actually had sharecroppers, and this is just a stone's throw from the Douglasville neighborhood. Evicted the sharecroppers off of that land, and then they were able to set up the school. Now, the not so secret is that school only lasted about 4 months. And Montgomery should take pride in the fact that the Wright brothers were here, but it wasn't a necessary long endeavor. What it did do, though, is it sort of sparked the imagination of especially the local business community, again, led by Mr. Cohn, to attract aviation here in Montgomery. And you think about 1910, the 19 teens, planes were brand new, right? This was the SpaceX of its time. And so who else was going to come and set up a civilian aviation school? Wasn't much industry for that. But our good friend Uncle Sam during World War One began, getting into this business. So they were able to work with Congressman Dent and land what was called the Aviation Repair Depot Number One, and that was set up in 1918. Again, now where the Maxwell Air Force Base is. It didn't have that name originally. And then in early 1920s, it became Maxwell Field. And they were set up right adjacent to Douglasville. So that was a success, but then quickly the war was over. And like dozens or maybe even hundreds of other locations, uh, the Department of War set up a base, but then the war was over, they closed it. So the local leadership wanted to make sure that Montgomery kept this base. So Congressman Dent, and then following him was Congressman Lister Hill, who's very well known in the community, was able to work the angles and get on the right committees and bring the right people to town to make Maxwell sort of a more permanent station. At some stage, the base needed more land, and to be fully a full-fledged aviation base meant you needed longer runways, you needed more capacity, more land for the warehouses and the housing and et cetera. And when they set up the Air Force Tactical School, this really kind of pushed the envelope on the need for more land. Well, if you look at the geography of the Cone Plantation and then the early Maxwell Field, right smack dab in the middle was Douglasville. So there was this pressure to sell this larger piece of land owned by Frank Cone and connected to Maxwell Air Force Base. Again, the the connectivity of the geographic area of Douglasville with the rest of the Frank Cone land spelled the end of the neighborhood. So in 1931, there was an eminent domain declaration, and they worked to again buy out the properties and buy out the families, and the families dispersed. The neighborhood was leveled, and then they built, again, the rest of the base with the flight lines, the officer housing, and other, needed developments for the base. So actually, Douglasville precedes, it began before there was even the thought of the Wright brothers coming to Maxwell. So in the first decade of the 20th century, that's when most of the development actually began. And that's when the streets were laid out and the houses were built and the churches and the stores, etc. I think the first properties were sold in 1898 or 99. So right at the turn of the century is when that whole process of the development began. Mainly of owners, and again within the sort of parameters of the time, these families were well off. They weren't multimillionaires by any stretch, but to have their own home, to have their own business, and the other interesting thing about Douglasville is folks had trades, the owners, and I've looked at the census documents, and I've looked at other documents here at the Montgomery County Archives, which have been invaluable for this study to show land ownership, et cetera. But folks, again, I've talked about, they owned their own businesses. There was quite a number of female entrepreneurs that owned the restaurants, and people worked as plasterers. This was sort of one of the well-known occupations that African Americans could do, right? Because sort of there was other industries that they were discriminated against from even getting into. Plasterers, carpenters, auto mechanics, people that worked for the trains, the railroad, engineers, people that worked at some of the cotton mills that were located on that west side of town. There was even a couple individuals that worked at Maxwell in the early days, and these were again decent jobs that you could make a living, and again, owning your own home, owning your own land, cultivating your own garden, being able to be more self-sufficient than your average person, not being a sharecropper in debt to a big landowner, and having that. Also, the sense of security that came with living within the city boundaries. And originally, Douglasville was not in the city boundary, in the municipal boundaries, but I think around 19 in the first decade, the map extended, and maybe 1908, and that afforded some safety and security that couldn't be found even just 5 miles down the road in an unincorporated part of the state. I would say, yeah, you could describe Douglasville as a middle class suburb of the city of Montgomery. So, maps are always an interest of mine. And here at the county archives, trying to again trace some sort of land ownership for what became known as Maxwell Air Force Base, discovering on a map this sort of little verbiage, Douglasville. What the heck is that? Never heard of that before. Ask some people on base. Ask the base historian. I think, yeah, we might have a folder about that. What do you know? Here's a little tiny bit of information about this neighborhood. You find it referenced in just a couple books on the history of Maxwell Air Force Base. Uh, Not much out there. So I pride myself as a great researcher. I might not be a great historian or a great writer, but research is always key, I think, for uncovering those lost stories. And I don't want to sound coarse, but I'm not interested in writing another biography about George Washington, right? There's plenty of other people out there doing it. Are biographies about George Washington popular? Are they better sellers? Absolutely. I would rather do something that very few others or no one has done. And that's sort of research areas that, again, have only the limited amount of information that's out there. So, surprisingly, though, from this map and from my research, I'm able to sort of put a narrative together. Again, the registry, the deeds at the county archives have been very illuminative on ownership and when and where and how, and then the land takings from the federal government and subsequent. And you might just have a footnote in a deed that will lead me to a newspaper article that then talks about a court case when the community fought the takeover, or certain members of the community fought takeover of their land. And being able to then ask those questions for the survivors of that neighborhood. So the maps really tell a story larger than sort of just a geographical representation on paper form. Yeah, the research again, I couldn't go down to the Department of Archives at Alabama and go to a shelf and open it up and have, here's the historical neighborhoods of Montgomery, and have 3 pages written about Douglasville. Doesn't exist. So where do you go? So again, as I said, seeing the one name of Douglasville on one map, finding other maps. From there, finding the deeds. From there, going to the census records. From there, going to the city directories. From there, meeting the people that are involved in the neighborhood. And I get a really interesting story. So one of my other hobbies is just to go around the city and take photos of public spaces, whether it's schools, businesses, churches, bridges, whatever. And so I was just riding up and down through a neighborhood on West Montgomery side, and there's a building, and there's an old sign up there, and it says the Douglasville Charitable Benevolent Society. Holy moly, that's Douglasville, right? And there's a sign showing that this neighborhood once existed. Now it's not in the neighborhood, but it's close by to the base. So I get out, knock on the door, nobody answers. I was ready to leave, just happened to see a guy walking up the street. I said, "Hey, do you know who lives here or anything about it?" He says, "No, but I think it's connected to the church around the corner." So I went over there. It was happened to be Sunday morning, and Mount Gilead Church, Baptist Church, is there on Day Street. Went inside the church and talked to the first person. "Oh, you have to go talk to Mr. Robinson." So Willie Robinson. "Oh, I'm the president of the Douglasville Charitable Benevolent Association." Tells me all the history. His sister is Elizabeth Shipley, the one that was born in the neighborhood. He was younger, so by the time he was born, the neighborhood had been already raised. Oh, we've got other people you should talk to. "Oh, go talk to this person." Oh, there's another church that was in the neighborhood. Didn't know that. Went to that church. Got information there. So it's sort of been like island hopping. You get a little bit, and then you hop to the next one and the next one. And it's, again, the discovery is sort of one of the most interesting parts of the research, right? Is finding that new story that, again, is out there, but no one's sort of brought illumination to it. One of the big takeaways from this is how um, little there is sort of written about the African American narrative in Alabama. And I'm not trying to castigate anyone. Uh, but part of what needs to be done, and I feel like I'm contributing in a small way, is to add to the archives. And because I'm collecting some stuff that's useful for my particular area of interest, but I'm hopeful that, other things that I gather will be of interest to future researchers, whether it's genealogists, etc. So there is a sort of a dearth in the written record on these things, and there are other sort of neighborhoods, Peacock Track, and there's a lot to be done to dig up more resources on these neighborhoods and the churches and the communities and the social networks and the businesses and the schools that were all invested in these. And of course, you think about, again, before integration, and before you could sort of live wherever you wanted to. People were had to live in certain neighborhoods, and the impact on the lack of availability of proper schooling or proper streets and sewers and the built environment. Uh, there is so much to be researched. So the big takeaway is that more to be done, and I hope again my piece when it gets published will encourage others to continue exploring. I always want to say that even if you think there's not a story, if you dig enough, there always is a great story, no matter where you go across the world. And Douglasville is an example of a great story that just needed a little bit of spotlight on. Yeah, I recently stumbled across an article that talked about again, this is in the South, and I believe it was Mississippi, And it was again a neighborhood that existed right up through the 1950s, but due to integration and due to changes in the sort of regionalization of the economy and economic pressures due towards the decline of agriculture, which is happening everywhere, right, in the U.S. for the most part. Uh, I come to think that there are hundreds of Douglasvilles right across the land, and I get the sense that people are really interested in this. Um, I met a gentleman the other day who's involved in the rehabilitation of a Rosenwald school up near the Georgia border, and I forget what the town is. New Hope, and I don't know if that's a town, but that's the the area. I think it's a subset of another larger town, or could be in an unincorporated area. Uh, People want to know about history. People want to know about their ancestors, about the struggles that people, went through, the successes and the celebrations that they might have had. And we all, you may not be interested in Auburn football, or you may not be interested in Boston Bruins hockey or politics or this. I think almost everyone is interested in history because everyone can make a connection to it in some facet, whether it's to their neighborhood, their old school, their old networks, their family history, genealogy, etc. So I really believe that more and more people are starting to, the history of George Washington has been written, right? The history of the Civil War. There's always a new take, fair enough. But I think local history and sort of micro history are really taking on uh, uh, lives of their own that are interesting, not just academics, but community historians and family historians, etc. Absolutely. I think the ability to make these connections to history, right, to the historical narrative, um, are dependent on what's in it for you, right? And so again, we're going to make, I'm not trying to make light of our first wonderful president that got us independence. But what is your connection in 2022 directly to George Washington? Obviously, the things that the founding fathers done, we're riding on those 200 plus years later, and they're wonderful. The Constitution, voting, I mean, all sorts of wonderful things. Were they perfect? No. Did the founding fathers approve of slavery? Yes, and 100 other bad things. Did they allow women to vote? No. Did they allow people that didn't own property to vote? No. But over time, the the foundations that they laid were built upon for progress, and I do believe in that. Um, so you may have an affinity for George Washington and the Revolutionary War, but I bet you have more of affinity to your neighborhood where you grew up. I do a lot of what I call contemporary history, sort of the history of the last 75 years, the history of memory. And when I did this research on Little Canada, one of the things I did is I found a lot of nice photos. Somebody from the city had gone around taking photos of all the buildings before the demolition. Somebody even took video of some of the raising of the buildings. And so, word of mouth, we had about 150 people show up to an event. This was in the 1990s. With all residents of that neighborhood, and the emotions were just uh, heart rendering. People yelling, swearing, crying, laughing, etc. So to be able to use history to evoke those emotions and to bring people back and have that reunion of sorts, I think is very powerful. And that's sort of the other. I sort of have a public historian hat on as well to say history doesn't people can do history for whatever purposes. For me, as I do it to make a connection to the present day and the people that are around us today. So the Rosenwald schools, and I know a little bit about them. Julius Rosenwald was, I guess, the either the owner or chief executive from Sears Roebuck, obviously one of the big success stories of retail of the 20th century. Not so much today, but back in the day, it was every city had a Sears, and of course the Sears catalogs, and they made a lot of money. So, what do you do with that money? Well, you do a lot of things, and hopefully, Julius Rosenwald had a very comfortable life. But giving back, right? And one of the areas that he saw a real true need for was to help African American communities get education. Either the public school systems were very wanting, as we all know, during the segregated times, or they were completely absent in many communities. So, and Rosenwald had a great formula, which wasn't just giving 100% of the funds needed to build schools, but asking the community to match and exceed the match. Really, I think oftentimes the community raised two-thirds or more of the money to build these uh, educational institutions. So these were built all through the South, and I think there was something like 4,000 of them. Many of them are gone, but some remain. And these were important institutions of learning, but also a source of pride for the African American community and community centers as well. So their reason for being was just more than just the 6 hours of education that a fourth grader could learn. So very important and symbolic yet real indicators of a community livelihood, of a community that was caring about each other and wanted to see their community grow and progress, right? So what's public history? Again, there's a wonderful organization, National Council for Public History, which I've been involved with over the years, and really it's taken history to the people, right? I guess you could say that, right? And that's what public means. So you have academic history, and that's wonderful. And I have a foot in that world, and teaching and educating and people getting doctorate, masters, and doctorate degrees, and doing rigorous analysis and theoretical debates at the deepest levels, and that's key to our understanding of history and our growing appreciation for diversity and thought. Well, public history has sort of taken that off that rail a little bit and making it more accessible to people. So what is public history? Public history is museums, right, and historic sites. It's how history interacts day to day with communities and individuals. It's documentaries that you watch on cable. It's websites. It's again uh, pushing history out to the everyday common place with some uncommon ideas, uncommon narratives, unknown histories, etc. Absolutely. So, museums, historic sites, historic homes, archives, libraries, these are all the key areas, physical areas, which push out public history all the time. Well, the book needs to be written. And I'm about maybe three-quarters done. And again, Douglasville is a piece of this story, but it's an arc really that goes from the earliest times. In fact, the land where Maxwell is known, by the native peoples as Tuwasa or Tuwasi. and there was some history there of when Hernan de Soto came through, the explorer, uh, interactions with the native peoples that were here, and basically slavery sort of began here, right in this area, as De Soto uh, compelled the natives to trade women as either laborers or sex slaves, or however you want to phrase it, for some trinkets, from spyglasses and other things. And that happened right here in Montgomery in the 1500s. Yeah, I think if you looked at most of my writings, they're sort of connected to the physical space, right? So, in my chapter in my dissertation about taking over the land for Little Canada, I used quotes at the beginning of each chapter, and for the quote on that, I used our fictional character Gerald O'Hara, and where he would say, land, it's the most important thing you'll ever have, you know. Uh, it's our blood, it's our soul. I forget the exact phrase. And I think by using the landscape and geography as lenses to understand how human interaction happens is a great way. There's a thousand other ways, but for me, again, I love maps. I love looking at land. I love understanding who owns, how it gets, how properties become either put together or ripped apart. The idea of land ownership and what that means versus, what how Native Hawaiians viewed ownership of, or not even, sort of ownership of land, but use of the land. And there's a thousand variations in between. And I think, again, back to sort of connectivity is people have connectivity to place. And so by highlighting the history of place, you can teach history. Yeah, a couple of the things that I discovered. One was a great connection, and that's Marsha Russell, who actually works at Maxwell Air Force Base with me. And again, serendipity. You happen to talk to somebody, and they said Douglasville. Yeah, that sounds familiar. I think one of my coworkers knows about that. Well, what do you know? She introduced me to Marsha, and Marsha has family roots in Douglasville, and she's a heck of a genealogist. And so we've worked together on uncovering, trading information. She had a lot of information I didn't, vice versa. And that's helped round out the story. One of the most interesting things that Marcia told me about, which I didn't know, was that the last residents of Douglasville that were moved were the people buried there. And so there was the Reese Cone Douglasville Cemetery, which had all denominations of religion, Methodist and Baptist, etc. And again, in order to allow for the flight line to be built, they had to disinter the bodies and relocate them elsewhere. So in the early 1930s, I think over 500, remains were physically moved. Most of them ended up in a cemetery that's sort of out on the again the far western reaches of the city, called the Kindle Cemetery. Maybe that even that name could be a corruption of Kendall, and that's where many of the folks that lived, breathed, and worked in Douglasville ended up. I should say the other component of Douglasville, the people that were forced to vacate the area, many of them ended up in this neighborhood where Mount Gilead Church is, and where this Douglasville charitable benevolent building is, which is now they don't use the hall anymore. They've moved the board meetings to the church, but in the downstairs is rented out by a family. Um, But that neighborhood has a formal name, but the informal name is Bear Max. And one of my areas of discovery is to try to figure out where did that name come from. I want to say the Max is Maxwell, but where Bear Max came from. So undoubtedly, up and down those streets are people that have today in 2022 some connection to Douglasville. Now, I don't have time to go knock on every door, but maybe somebody watching this video might say, I've got a family connection to Douglasville, and I'd love to talk to them.